The transition in Venezuela has already begun, although not in the way that you might be thinking.
Ya entrando en la nueva época de transición al socialismo 2031, hoy 27 de agosto, bueno, hacer una remodelación profunda del gobierno nacional y acoplar un equipo nuevo. Estamos haciendo algunos ajustes para fortalecer el equipo en esta nueva etapa, para arrancar como un cohete, como un cohete.
Like a rocket. Yes, this time he's right. Venezuela is on a rocket ship, but one headed for disaster. Nicolás Maduro Moros, with his hands freshly washed after openly stealing the 28th of July elections, has decided to replace his cabinet. Because you know how it goes, new fraud, new life. You see, the Venezuelan government has a modest total of 34 ministries, a perfect bureaucratic machine for paying political favors and channeling all the unconscionable corruption that surrounds this crazy government. Although the facade of Chavismo is gigantic, the reality is that, when it comes down to it, only a few ministries have real political clout. And as you all know that we're talking about a dictatorship that's sustained by oil and the shady business of drug trafficking, I don't think I need to tell you which portfolios are the most important. Exactly. The Ministry of Interior, the Ministry of Defense, and the Ministry of Petroleum, which is exactly the ones which Maduro has reorganized in the last few days.
Ratificando a Delcy Rodríguez como vicepresidenta ejecutiva de la República Bolivariana de Venezuela para que siga con el timón al frente del gobierno revolucionario. También le he pedido, dado que entrega el Ministerio de Finanzas, que Delcy Rodríguez asuma el Ministerio de Petróleo en Venezuela como conocedora de este tema. Se trata del capitán bolivariano Diosdado Cabello Rondón, nuevo ministro del Poder Popular de Interior, Justicia y Paz y vicepresidente de Gobierno para la paz. Paz, paz, paz. En el campo de la vicepresidencia sectorial de Defensa y Soberanía, bueno, ratifico al ministro del Poder Popular para la Defensa, general en jefe Vladimir Padrino López, como ministro y vicepresidente sectorial.
Delcy Rodríguez, Diosdado Cabello, and Vladimir Padrino. These names may not mean anything to many of you, but we're talking about the great leaders of the socialist revolution in Venezuela. Delcy Rodríguez is the vice president of the country and Maduro's political right hand. She was also a minister during the Hugo Chavez era. And her brother, Jorge Rodríguez, is the president of the National Assembly, the Venezuelan parliament. Come on, a whole dynasty within the regime. Diosdado Cabello is the perverse head of the party and of the dictatorship. He's an expert in repression, torture, and drug trafficking. Not because he fights against it, but because he himself directs it. Meanwhile, Vladimir Padrino has been the Minister of Defense since 2014, the strongman of Chavismo in the armed forces. He's the one who makes sure that the military is tied, and well tied, to the interests of the party. Well, now that you know a little bit about them, let's be clear about one thing. We aren't only talking about high-ranking positions, but about the guys who really have the power. Cabello, Rodríguez, and Padrino have consolidated their influence in Chavismo as never before. They are now, without any doubt, the top hierarchs of this Socialism 2031. It's a sequel that has gone from being a bad soap opera to a real horror movie. So here on VisualPolitik, we've asked several questions that I'm sure you've been wondering about too. What is behind these changes in such crucial areas? Is it a sign of weakness or of radicalization of the regime? Why has Maduro not even waited to take office before reorganizing his government? Who wins and who loses with these latest moves? Well, we're going to see all this and more right now. So let's get started. On its own, a change of government shouldn't be anything particularly striking. Changes are commonplace, even within Maduro's own Venezuela.
Vamos a leer el equipo de trabajo. Hay un conjunto de compañeros que van a continuar en sus responsabilidades. Hay otros que van a ocupar nuevas responsabilidades.
However, such a big change at such a tense time as this is not an everyday occurrence. VisualPolitik community, in dictatorships, name changes are not so much an opportunity to improve governments as to strengthen their network of influence. Or in other words, to get rid of old dogs in order to put in stronger dogs that are more loyal to the regime structure. But then, what's so special about the change announced by the Venezuelan satrap? Well, to answer this question, let's start by taking a closer look at the new key areas and what has changed with the latest announcements. The changes implemented by the Chavista dictatorship involve one thing above all: the rise of the heavyweights of the United Socialist Party of Venezuela to the most high-ranking and powerful positions in the country. Maduro seems to have made an all-in. That is, a bet with all the chips he had in his hand. But let's look at it in more detail. Let's start with the good old black gold, the basic building block that sustains the regime. From now on, the oil ministry and the presidency of PDVSA will be split into two different positions. They will no longer be held by the same person. Now, on the one hand, we'll have Delcy Rodriguez, who, as you'll remember, is the vice president, and who has now also become the country's highest energy authority. In other words, in economic matters, this woman becomes one of the most influential figures in the country, if not the most influential of all. On the other hand, Hector Obregon becomes president of PDVSA, the ailing but still influential Venezuelan state-owned oil company. In practice, this change implies much less autonomy of PDVSA from the highest echelons of Chavismo. Previously, since the Ministry of Petroleum and the presidency of the oil company were under the control of the same person, the oil company had a little bit more independence. Now, however, Obregon is hierarchically below Delcy and will be accountable to her. In this way, the state oil company, the goose that lays the golden eggs, the most coveted treasure of the dictatorship, will be much more closely tied to the United Socialist Party of Venezuela, or PSUV, leadership. Then, in the Ministry of the Interior, Admiral-in-Chief Remigio Ceballos has been replaced by Diosdado Cabello. Remember, he's the narco fan of torture and repression. By the way, it's a change that curiously marks a setback for the influence of the military, which, as we've told you in previous videos, has been gaining a lot of power in recent years. This could lead to a certain rupture, or at least a cooling off, between the uniformed forces and the Maduro government. That would be good news. Even so, another reading can also be made, and that is that the military might be comfortable to let the PSUV do the dirty work, because logically, this is the Ministry of Repression. We'll look at this in more detail later. And finally, the man everyone points to as Maduro's top supporter, Vladimir Padrino, has been ratified as head of the Ministry of Defense. So the question is, what do these changes tell us? Well, if we review the stars in the Socialism 2031 project, the main cast looks something like this. And let's not forget that Jorge Rodriguez, Delcy's brother, is the president of the National Assembly. That means that now the legislative power and the economic and energy power of Venezuela are under the control of the same family lineage, that of the Rodriguez family. And what does this mean? Well, for Maduro, the Rodriguez family are the figures who are most loyal to the regime and to Maduro's own presidency. In other words, Maduro has closed ranks with those closest to him when it comes to taking economic and political control of the revolution. And at the same time, as I was saying earlier, while in practice the Rodriguezes are going to control the politics and the economic sustenance of Chavismo, Diosdado Cabello is going to control repression, the iron fist, and also justice. He's given carte blanche to a guy who is a total psychopath, an element who is seen to enjoy talking publicly about who is being tortured and who is being made to disappear.
Freddy Superlano, que está detenido y hablando muy bien, es bilingüe.
To speak of Cabello is to speak of a sadistic criminal, no holds barred, in the purest mafia fashion. In fact, he's considered the evil mind of the Chavista regime. He's the mind behind the system of repression, the political police, and the tortures. He's the one who's been in charge of adapting the teachings of the Cuban school of repression in Venezuela since the beginning of Chavismo. And he's also intimately linked to the military world and the cartel of the Suns, which is the drug trafficking network that involves the Venezuelan military. And of course, he is also one of the guys with the toughest positions within Chavismo. Well, this person is now the new and powerful leader of the Ministry of Interior, Justice, and Peace of Venezuela. And what does this mean? Well, by placing Cabello at the head of the Ministry of the Interior, the Chavista government is sending a very clear message to the opposition. We are coming for you. In other words, if he already managed the entire criminal apparatus of Chavismo from the vice presidency of the party, which allowed him to be a little in the shadows, now he'll be doing it in the open, and with the entire judicial system also at his fingertips. And VisualPolitik community, I'm not going to deny it. Imagining this guy with so much power, power, and operating out in the open is pretty scary. It's certainly not good news. And finally, we come to Vladimir Padrino, the guy who controls the army with an iron fist. In this case, we aren't talking about any change, because he will continue in the same position as Ministry of Defense. But with him, the true leadership of Chavismo and the government is completed. Padrino is the one who, for a decade, has been successfully ensuring that the armed forces do not rebel against him, among other things, by imposing a regime of terror inside the barracks so that no one dares to question power. In short, now we have the Rodriguez family, Diosdado Cabello, and Vladimir Padrino with more power than ever, and above all, with more sense of impunity than ever. Maduro has removed or demoted some political profiles, but on top of that, and this is perhaps the most striking, he's reduced the number of military personnel in key areas. Could this be a symptom that things with those in uniform are not going so well? It's too early to say. What we can say is that the elections have been a kind of reset for the government. If the Chavistas previously had even a minuscule interest in keeping up appearances, now they are going all out and not holding anything back. However, we wouldn't be telling you the whole story if we were to focus only on the names. So we have asked some more questions. Why is Maduro reducing the presence of the military in the government? Is this something agreed with them, or does it show fissures? Is the regime solid, or is there a lot of window dressing and cracks abounding? Well, let's find out.
Double or nothing.
Before the electoral fraud of 28th of July, there were those who said that Chavismo was weaker than ever, that they were afraid of losing, that these elections were going to be a turning point, that we were facing a historic event. Well, what can I say? The opposition mobilizations, the electoral campaign, and the avalanche of votes against Maduro seem to be the spearhead of an inevitable change. But it seems that when a dictatorship is cornered, it does not function as a democracy. The dictatorship does not retreat, but instead doubles down. And that's exactly what the regime has done. Increase repression to instill fear everywhere and crush any possibility of transformation. However, in spite of everything, rumors flew. It was said that several Chavista leaders had been contacted by the opposition to test a possible transition. In fact, during the months of June and July, it is believed that some of Chavismo's mid-level figures may have shown a somewhat more flexible revolutionary loyalty. And that is why, although the new cabinet has only been in place for a few days, the new strong figures of the Chavista government are already starting with the purges and the heavy hand. For starters, Diosdado Cabello is making a good debut in his position as the head of the country's security, that is to say, of the repressive machine. The clearest case is that of Juan Carlos del Pino, one of the 5 rectors of the National Electoral Council, supposedly an opponent, but with the endorsement of the pro-Chavez National Assembly. Well, not long ago, del Pino denounced irregularities in the vote counting and totalization process. Nothing we don't know, but of course, what is relevant is that, in this case, it was a member of the Electoral Council until Inspector Cabello came into action.
Del Pino engrosar la lista de los traidores a la patria que le ofrecieron a los gringos villas y castillos. No tiene nada, no tiene nada, porque si él tuviera algo, tuviera que reconocer la victoria de Nicolás Maduro.
VisualPolitik community, the Socialism 2031 project, which is how Maduro has described this new phase, is sending 2 clear messages to the entire Venezuelan political spectrum. The first is addressed to the regime itself. It's time to align. No doubts or soft loyalties will be tolerated. Now the repressive apparatus under Cabello's orders will be more aggressive than ever, and will be particularly so with the traitors. The intelligence corps will no longer be dedicated to crushing the opposition alone, but also, and much more than before, to eliminating internal fissures, such as Del Pino. And don't forget what we already told you, Diosdado is a guy directly linked to the cartel of the Suns. He is, in fact, one of their bosses. And when we say cartel of the Suns, we're talking about the network of organized crime and drug trafficking that sustains the regime from the shadows. The fact is that his work at the head of the security and repression agencies will surely cause several heads to roll within Chavismo, either for lack of loyalty or for business reasons. Shady business, of course. And then we also have what we were telling you before, the coincidence of the appointment of Cabello and the Rodriguez family within the same group. Because, let's see, if Cabello is going to be in charge of the Iron Fist, the Rodriguez, dominating the legislative power, will surely redouble their efforts to furnish the Iron Fist of the repressive apparatus with more legislation. Don't forget that we're talking about the same sectors that have promoted laws, such as the law against fascism and the law against hate. Two laws that, far from having nothing to do with their names, actually serve to crush the political freedoms of the opposition and restrict freedom of expression in the country as much as possible. They are two sides of the same coin, used as legal weapons to imprison dozens and dozens of dissidents. And do you know what the worst thing is? Well, they are going about it in the open, and are warning of their plans with total impunity.
Hoy yo creo que Venezuela se encamina por el rumbo de la paz definitiva, una paz con justicia, una paz donde el pueblo sienta que aquellos que han actuado en contra de la Constitución y de la ley sea aplicada la justicia a tiempo.
The Rodriguezes will make the law, and Cabello will execute it to the letter. Simply and clearly, Maduro has armed key areas of his government with the most radical and perverse profiles of his closest circle. The purge is the immediate future of politics in Venezuela. But wait a minute, what about the armed forces? Wasn't it the military that supported Maduro? Well, here comes the second message. Until very recently, the presence of the military in the government was growing until almost 2/3 of the executive was made up of high-ranking members of the armed forces. However, recent changes have altered that trend. In some ways, Socialism 2031 could have a smaller olive-green presence. In fact, and judging by Delcy Rodriguez's new role, it's likely that the oil structure will begin to pass completely to civilian hands, and that would be an important development. It's strange that just at a time like this, Maduro wants to remove the military and put the control of the country's cash cow into the hands of his most faithful among the faithful. That could mean fear. Of course, as long as the cartel of the Sun's networks continue to operate, the uniformed officers will most likely continue to be government accomplices. This is something we will only be able to see with the passage of time. Is Maduro afraid of the military? Or, on the contrary, has he told the military, let's clean up our act? Only time will tell. What's our take on this? Well, that pushing the military aside and locking yourself up alone with the group of the most loyal is not exactly a sign of strength. Basically, you do these things when you don't trust yourself, or you're afraid of losing control. But of course, it's one thing to make these changes when you don't feel very strong, and quite another when you're about to fall. Therefore, the question is whether this repressive triad is really prepared to sustain Maduro for 6 more years. Is it possible to rule out a rupture within Chavismo thanks to this new organizational chart? Has Maduro left the regime tied up, and well tied up? Well, let's take a look.
A shot of realism.
Let's be realistic, and believe me, I wish I didn't have to say this, but quite the opposite. The opposition hoped that the electoral defeat would deal a hard blow to Chavismo, that this would open internal cracks and force the regime to negotiate an orderly transition, for fear of a popular or military uprising that would end it all. Yet, more than a month after the fraudulent elections, none of this has happened, and we now find ourselves with a new cabinet, apparently tougher than the previous one. The dictator has burned all his bridges by placing the most radical profiles at the helm of the critical areas of the power apparatus. And although Chavismo is already lord and master of Venezuela, everything is being set up for 2025 to go for everything. To begin with, the Venezuelan regime has already announced the holding of mega elections for 2025. The entire legislative branch will be renewed, and 23 governors and 335 mayors will be elected, as well as the 23 provincial legislatures and 335 municipal councils, and all with the democratic guarantee of the Rodriguez brothers and Diosdado Cabello, who have already announced that they will work to ensure that in these elections there will be no political parties that have betrayed the fatherland. In other words, only the government and the government's cronies will be able to run. And to top it all off, let's not forget that the Supreme Court of Justice recently ratified Nicolás Maduro's victory. However, the minutes have not yet been published by the CNE, supposedly due to a critical hacking incident suffered on July 28th. In other words, for now, the move seems to be going reasonably well. All branches of power in Venezuela are responding to Chavismo without complaint. And for now, nothing within the regime's inner workings seems to be moving towards the opposition side. We wish we could bring better news, but for now, we can't. The only glimmer of hope is that Maduro is effectively sidelining the military because he no longer trusts them. Be that as it may, hopefully that glimmer of hope will end up becoming a light. Here on VisualPolitik, we will be paying close attention to everything that happens. But for now, it's it's your turn. What do you think about the new Chavismo appointments? What can we expect from criminals like Diosdado Cabello and the Rodriguez family heading Venezuelan institutions? What options do you think are left for the opposition? Well, leave us your opinions below in the comments and let's start a debate. And very important, if you liked this video, hit the like button and subscribe to VisualPolitik if you haven't already done so. As always, thank you very much for being there. All the best. I'll see you next time.